Good day and welcome to the first video lecture for Social Science 198. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce to you postcolonialism or postcolonial studies. For this presentation, make sure that you have read the required reading as posted on the VLE, which is Young 2003, the introduction in chapter 1. There will also be recommended readings based on the sources I used in this presentation. As this is the first recorded lecture, some tips. Make sure to take notes, even though you will be given the copy of the PowerPoint. Ask questions that you may have while listening later in our synchronous sessions. So I would like to clarify that, of course, I am not the only source of knowledge in this class, and I would very much like to discuss what I have said in this lecture in our synchronous sessions. Also, as this is an introduction, it may not be as exhaustive as we would like it to be in the interest of time. And also, as we will be discussing ideas and concepts mentioned here throughout the semester. So this is to introduce you to the main topic of this special topics course, which is postcolonialism. So the main or essential question for this presentation is, what is postcolonialism? So do we mean different things when we say postcolonialism with the hyphen after the prefix post? Yeah, so that's one question. We will also clarify the terms that we will be using with the modifier postcolonial, such as studies, theory, critique, discourse, to refer to very similar things. However, what needs clarification and definition is our description of what is postcolonial. This is important as we will be using this term for this whole semester, and it is significant that we know the meanings behind it. And the terms that are similar to it, like for example, the use of third world, south, or transcontinental, etc. Okay, so here is the outline for today. First, we trace or at least review the theoretical foundations of postcolonialism. You have already encountered some of these theories and concepts in some of your social science courses. We will identify which fields, theories, and concepts are intricately linked to the beginnings and the present of postcolonialism as a body of work of postcolonial scholars. Next, we situate postcolonialism in time and space. In the time component, we answer the question, when is postcolonialism? And in the space component, we ask, where is postcolonialism? In answering these basic questions, we map the general landscape of what, when, where, and most importantly, who is the postcolonial. We will be able to describe the usual scope and focus of the many critical perspectives that are considered or are inspired by postcolonialism. We then summarize the scope and focus into three terms: people, identities, and resistance. As postcolonialism does not just introduce itself as academic, but also a way to emancipate previously colonized and currently neo-colonized peoples, it is important to note that postcolonialism does not just delve on the intellectual exercise of unearthing and discussing the colonial past. It has the radical aim to emancipate peoples and to be a tool for this liberation of peoples through both analysis and action. In this part, we also preview some of the main ideas of postcolonialism that will be fleshed out through the semester. First, of course, we have the term postcolonial. At first glance, of course, you see the two parts in the word, which is post and colonial. It is thus a term that could be understood once these two parts of it are also discussed and understood. So we will discuss this in this presentation. So you see here a map of the Commonwealth of Nations, nations that are, see there, England is there, and then countries that were previously its colonies. So I am sure that when we look at the word postcolonialism, we are reminded of the history of colonization in the world and in our country, given that we have more than 300 years of it. When we hear this term postcolonial, it would not surprise us to know that this set of perspectives we call postcolonialism started from an analysis of this very history of colonization. While it's not academic sources per se, I am also sure that you have seen memes of how so many countries in the world have independence days except Britain or England, because they are the country that the rest of the world is seeking, England or the United Kingdom, because they are the country that the rest of the world is seeking independence from. Of course, the UK was not the only imperialist in the world, but what this shows is a possibility of a common experience between and among countries that were previously colonized, from the start of colonialism in the 1400s up to the present. This is where postcolonialism as a set of perspectives start. Scholars from different disciplines began an intellectual engagement with the consequences of colonization, with a political and cultural analysis of the legacies of colonization that resulted in systematic theorizing in the part of postcolonial writers. So it began from that. So in general, there is no one definition of postcolonialism or postcolonial studies. It cannot be generalized. One thing to know too is it does not have a disciplinary home. From here, we read some definitions of a postcolonial or postcolonialism and see the common thread among them that we can use for this course. So first, we have this definition from Burke 2000 from their book, What is Cultural History? Defining postcolonialism as a reaction against the grand narrative of Western civilization through an increasing awareness of what is left out or made invisible. And then Young 2003 says that postcolonialism is a body of writing. See, they don't say that it's a discipline. It's a body of writing that attempts to shift the dominant ways in which the relations between Western and non-Western people and their worlds are viewed. Another definition here from Young 2001, postcolonial theory involves a political analysis of the cultural history of colonialism and investigates its contemporary effects in Western and tricontinental cultures, making connections between that past and the politics of the present. So far we have words such as politics, culture, grand narratives, dominant narratives, invisible narratives that postcolonialism is trying to unearth. And so those are the things that we will also be discussing in the class. And those are the core ideas behind the postcolonialism. Okay, so some more definitions. So here from Garcia, while obviously anti-colonial, postcolonial theory thus challenges the complex relationship between knowledge and power, which is to say between privileged institutions and discourses and the various oppressions they spawn. In other words, postcolonialism necessarily engages with the philosophical and political question of how knowledge functions in whatever context and for the benefit of which groups of people. And so, as I've said in our synchronous session, the study of postcolonialism basically is a study of power. So that's why we could be studying it in the lens of political science, for example, and social sciences, because essentially it's a study of the relationship of power and knowledge. So these are things that are not distinct to postcolonialism only. So we will see that later. So that's another definition. Then you have this, postcolonialism names a politics and a philosophy of activism that contests that disparity and so continues in a new way the anti-colonial struggles of the past. Now, so you see here a recognition of a continuity of a history of colonialism, the effects of such, and a characterization of the field as politics as a philosophy, something that is not just in the academe. So we will see that as we define postcolonialism. So there are still many sources that we can use to define postcolonialism. One way we could have a better understanding of the common thread that we see in these definitions is through looking at how postcolonialism began and where could we connect or locate this set of perspectives. So Edward Said's Orientalism, first published in the late 1970s, is considered a pioneering work in postcolonialism. The literature almost has a consensus on this. I showed you a while ago a map of the Commonwealth nations, which was composed of the United Kingdom and its former colonies and some allies. The first instance of postcolonial work was in this area where Commonwealth literature was studied in terms of the production of literary works of postcolonial peoples. You will also see that some key texts in postcolonialism are studies of literature. Indeed, according to Ashcroft et al. In 2013, I quote, "The term postcolonial per se was first used to refer to cultural interactions within colonial societies and literary circles," unquote. Um, Mostly, this was a study on the structure and context, which is historical, societal, political, of published literatures, imagery, and representation of empire and the colonized, among others. Edward Said's work indeed can be contextualized in this beginning of postcolonialism. Said's work was heavily inspired by Michel Foucault with his emphasis on discourse. Not coincidentally, the period 1980s to 1990s marked the so-called linguistic and cultural turns in many disciplines, including many social sciences. So you may review your SOCSI 100 for the definition of these ideas of linguistic and cultural turns. There was a focus on the text and its context, and on culture and meaning and power and knowledge. Postcolonialism, thus, was at the core of these turns, as early colonial discourse theorists like Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha were also inspired, or they used heavily, the concepts from post-structuralists like Foucault, Althusser, Lacan, and Derrida, among others. These turns and movements gave birth to several more movements that could be considered postcolonial. One example is the subaltern school of Indian historiography that aims at retelling history from the counter-hegemonic standpoints of the colonized. So this coincided with post-war liberation and nationalist movements in many parts of the world that not only validated but also empowered the post-colonial discourse inside and outside of the academe. So post-colonialism as a set of theories and perspectives, as I have said before, is not a discipline basically because it does not have its own method or its own theories. These traditions, forms of analysis, like isms, feminism, Marxism, show this. Young 2001 discusses how postcolonialism or postcolonial theory draws from Marxist critique, as Marxism was one of the first perspectives that emphasized the effects of the imperialist system and the dominating power structure involved, and in sketching out blueprints for a future free from domination and exploitation. Most 20th century anti-colonial writing was inspired by the possibilities of socialism. So that's from Young 2001, page 6. This makes sense because Marxism, like post-colonialism, is a, quote, a theoretical and philosophical movement that that discusses oppression, suffering, that were also characteristic of post-colonial peoples or populations. However, as Young 2001 discussed, Marxism was still a Western construct. Nonetheless, Marxism was translated to fit the cultures of post-colonial societies. Young 2001 in pages 7 and 10 discusses this further, that post-colonial theory is distinguished from orthodox European Marxism by combining its critique of objective material conditions with detailed analysis of their subjective effects. So you have the material conditions that is always at the core of Marxism, plus an analysis of their subjective or the effects of these structures to the individual human person. And that post-colonial critique incorporates the legacy of the syncretic traditions of Marxisms that developed outside the West in the course of anti-colonial struggles, and subsequently in the development of the further forms of emancipation of gender, ethnicity, and class necessary for liberation from bourgeois nationalism. End of quote. This is very important, as we will see later that post-colonialism puts premium on the possibility of change in the world that it studies. And the Marxist tradition, or Marxism itself, already has the theories, the theories and the discussions from not just from the West but also from other post-colonial scholars on how emancipation could be done. All right. So it was so therefore the beginning or many of the early post-colonial theorists were heavily influenced by Marxism. So second, you have feminism. You saw the discussion of Young 2003 on how similar feminism and post-colonialism is in terms of the way they are both not disciplines but are sets of perspectives that could sometimes be contradictory. In the same vein, Both of them also underline oppression that is a result of a marker of insidious power or and the power in the private sphere, which is reminiscent of how post-colonial theorists characterize the cultural and very personal effects of colonialism. Gendered oppression can also be seen in texts, even literary or supposedly objective texts like history books, where feminine characteristics like weak, meek, submissive, etc. are used to describe a whole population of colonized peoples. We will have a special topics portion of the class to discuss the very intimate relations between post-colonialism and feminism. Next, you have post-structuralism and postmodernism, as I've mentioned in the previous slide, is also a major influence in post-colonialism. Basically, they adopted the rejection of meta-narratives inherent in postmodernist work in the academe and rejected the linear history presupposed in the discourse of development. This discourse means that denotes that the measure of development is that you have succeeded in capitalist and democratic terms. And some scholars say that that is the proper end of history. So with linear history, there's development. But post-colonialism, both post-colonialism and postmodernism is rejecting that. Post-colonialism also rejects the idea that colonialism was good because it brought with it modernity. It shares the sentiments of post-structuralists and postmodernists regarding the failures of modernity and how it should not be the dominant narrative of the contemporary world. Modernity emphasizes individualism, for example, when what is needed in the present is a return to the collective or the community. Lastly, you have decolonization or decolonial studies that began during the same period, but before and until now, it connotes a different meaning. It meant that countries were in the actual process of gaining independence. That was decolonization when you're a country and you're just newly independent. Like for example, the Philippines in the latter part of the 1940s. That's decolonization. It's the actual process. Okay. But decolonization in the literature refers to both this process, the actual process that the country is being independent. Okay, this was either through revolution or the colonizer leaving because of certain pressures, and the many ways that this process is not yet done or is not yet finished in the present. So some theorists that started this were Frantz Fanon, Ames Césaire, Albert Memmi, and C.L.R. James. So that's from Quaison, 2005. What you could notice in these theoretical foundations is that these are very Western. However, Quaison, 2005 argues that this has been joined to an impulse to formulate non-Western modes of discourse as significant ways of challenging the West. Okay, so you start from Western ideas, but you use actually these ideas to fight back. Okay, so one of the first attempts to do so, at least in the academe or those works that are published, was the book by Ashcroft et al., The Empire Writes Back. So you have that in your Google Drive. Given the previous definitions and some of the theoretical foundations and inspirations of postcolonialism, it is a good time now to address the post in postcolonialism. Do we use it with the hyphen or not? Indeed, the hyphen in the term is very controversial. This is where we begin to locate postcolonialism in time, as the term is usually used to denote the period or the historical period after the fact of colonialism. That is acceptable when we are referring to this period that is specific for every country and in general, the post-war period when almost all countries have already gained independence. What is not acceptable is if we use it literally, because for post-colonial theorists, this period in history, post-colonialism, is still not yet done. It's not yet finished. We are thus in a post-colonial world. It kind of connotes a linear history wherein the natural order of things is that when a country gains independence, they will be post-colonial, or that colonization and colonialism is a finished business. Again, the double entendre in the term is that it recognizes the historical fact, but nuances it with the idea that colonialism is not a finished business. Note that the term postmodernism and the other posts, like post-structuralism, also suffer from this ambivalence, according to critics. In the case of the postmodern, there is the issue of where the modern ends and the postmodern starts, for example. For Appia, 1991, the post as well as the hyphen is a space clearing gesture. So Appia's article cited here actually discusses postmodernism in art, as he asks whether an African sculpture of a man in a bicycle, the picture here, is postmodern or postcolonial enough for European museums to evaluate. Some call this kind of art neo-traditional. He notes the persisting binaries that the West still use. Like, this cannot be accepted as modern because it is from Africa and it is not consistent with modern style art. It's also not traditional because it was created during the contemporary period. He also notes the crisis of modernity when the expected outcomes of modern theorists, like secularization, did not happen in the modern and contemporary world. There is more religion, for example, except that everything in the contemporary world, including religion, is for sale. Just like this sculpture. It is called neo-traditional art, or art that is done in a pre-colonial manner but is marketed for the West for their consumption. It does not occupy a space in the modern or the traditional. So he uses this example to note that the post in postcolonialism and postmodernism with the hyphen is the process of clearing oneself a space when one does not fit in the binaries that are dominant in Western thinking. So you get a new space, which is, for example, here neo-traditional, which can be another construction of the West, or another space that is made or created by the creator of this sculpture itself. So to quote from Appia, postmodernism can be seen then as a retheorization of the proliferation of distinctions that reflects the underlying dynamic of cultural modernity, the need to clear oneself a space. Modernism saw the economization of the world as triumph of reason. Postmodernism rejects that claim, allowing in the realm of theory the same proliferation of distinctions that modernity has begun. So the post is a reaction to the strict categorizing of what is modern and mainstream. So the categories are here, the binaries that I have been saying is here. Like for modernism, you have creation, totalization, the universalization, ganyan, synthesis, while postmodernism is the opposite, which is decreation, deconstruction, and antithesis, centering versus dispersal, the grand histoire or the narrative, grand narrative, versus the anti-narrative or the petit histoire, or small narratives. Okay, that is at the core of postmodernism. So these are values or concepts in modernism and postmodernism. Okay, so I won't be discussing this, but I will be linking a lecture video that I have already done through for another class, so you could understand, the modernism that is being reacted to by both postmodernism and postcolonialism. So essentially, Appia is saying that the post or the hyphen is this idea of clearing up a space for oneself because you're not in these binaries, or that you don't want to be in these categories. So thus, the post in postcolonialism is similar to that of postmodernism, along with the problematic behind it. We also nuance it with the usual treatment of the prefix as a reaction to the term it precedes. Like, for example, postcolonialism is a reaction to colonialism, okay? And the period after. So postcolonialism is the period after colonialism. So note these when we use the term. We can use both postcolonialism with or without the hyphen. So yun lang yung yun lang yung kanyang intricacies, kumbaga. But in this course, whether or not you use post with the hyphen or post with no hyphen, it still means the same as long as you know what postcolonial means, which will be the discussions for the next slides. So apparently also our use of ism at the end of it has meaning too, noting the fact that postcolonialism is not a discipline nor a clear-cut ideology, but it can still be distinguished from other positions or other field of inquiry, similar to how we treat or study feminism, post-structuralism, Marxism, etc. Okay, so at this point you may ask, is postcolonialism the same as postmodernism? No. Okay, however, according to Quaison, postmodernism can never fully explain the state of the contemporary world without first becoming postcolonial and vice versa. So we'll see how we can make use of this statement in this course. Okay, but what is important in everything that we do here is that we always need historical context. We always need to look at the process of how things, like for example, how theorists say that post-colonial populations are still affected by colonialism in the present, and there are specific context. Okay, so yun, it's not the same, but they surely have inspired each other. Post-colonialism, because our subject is post-colonialism. Post-colonialism has been inspired by the by postmodernism, and vice versa. So if we locate postcolonialism in time, as Spivak notes, we are currently living in a postcolonial neo-colonized world. So if we ask when is postcolonialism, it is today. It is the present. It has no definite start, especially when each country's context is different and we do not, or we cannot and we do not generalize. Note, however, that the term post-colonial state was increasingly used after the Second World War, according to Ashcroft et al. In 2013. This means that the colonial we are referring to is the colonial period from the European expansion from the 1400s to the 1900s. Because a critique to post-colonialism is that, what colonialism are you talking about? Is it the colonialism even of ancient peoples before, when they conquered other areas, like for example, the empires of China, ganyan. So it is pretty clear in the ideas of post-colonialism that the neo-colonial world, the post-colonial world that we are talking about now, is not directly related to those ancient empires, but with the legacies really of European colonialism. Okay, so we want to clarify that. But if you want to discuss that further, we can discuss that further in our synchronous session. Okay, so to add to that, no, so we live in a post-colonial, neo-colonial world. It is clear that we can define post-colonialism historically. Sinasabi ko kanina, after the instance of colonialism. So it looks at the tangible and intangible repercussions of the period preceding it, which is colonialism. And for many post-colonial theorists, it is about that continuity of the colonial history and the present history. Okay? Yeah. And so if you want to locate where post-colonial peoples are, you will see that it's so many parts of the world. You see that Africa is almost, shaded. And if there are parts that are not shaded in some periods, they are in other periods. So this is why we have yung sinasabi ko kanina, what I was saying a while ago, about a common experience. Though you cannot generalize that every experience of colonialism is the same, you could say that there is a common experience because most of the world have experienced it. Some, it's not direct colonialism. Like for example, for some indigenous peoples who are just for example, some indigenous peoples in the Philippines would claim that they were not under colonialism, but many other indigenous peoples in other countries now would look back at their history and the history of violence therein. So thus it's very important for post-colonial peoples like us to to look at this history. So there will be another lecture on colonialism, imperialism, ganyan, to look at how different kinds of colonialism are, different from each other, because there is no one type of colonialism or imperialism, and what do those ideas or histories tell us about the present world order. Okay. So as I've said a while ago, if we are looking at post-colonialism in space, those are the countries. It is basically the entire world. Okay, but why is it that we just refer to post-colonial peoples as those in the South, as those in the third world, right? Because of certain discourses that have been dominant through the years. So as space, the post-colonial is of course found in areas previously claimed by colonizers. Through time, there have been many terms that have been used, such as third world, the South, the developing world, all of which refer to the post-colonial. Other theories, like the world systems theory, locate it in the peripheries, not just in the world, but in every country where there could be exploitative relationships between the center and the periphery. This led to other terms like provincializing Europe, as it was dominant and at the center of the world, literally in terms of politics, economy, etc., and figuratively in its representations in cartography, in literature, mainstream media, etc., to the point that some critics note that the idea of globalization is synonymous to westernization. Patajo Legasto in 2004, in 1993, notes how postcoloniality in this sense is a position. We postcolonials find ourselves in this position of postcoloniality, spatially and temporally. This position has defined us throughout history, like when the term third world has not been used objectively to refer to non-aligned nations, such as nations that are neither socialist nor capitalist, but subjectively and derogatorily, okay, referring to countries that are poor, debt, famine, and conflict-ridden. So that's Young 2001 and Patajo Legasto. Postcolonials like Filipinos are constructed as an other, specifically an ontological other. This means that their existence is contingent with the West knowing them. Non-whites can only be categorized as humans once the West deems they are civilized enough. As a position, it is occupying a territory that is almost always regarded as the opposite of what is accepted, as in the rest, in the term the West and the rest. The response to this entails a deterritorialization of the dominant discourses through attempting to make whole their fractured, deformed identities in order to create new identities and modes of existence outside universalizing or homogenizing Eurocentric perspectives. So the idea of finding your identity is also finding your position, or, claiming your position as postcoloniality, as postcolonial. Postcolonial peoples developed a kind of consciousness or two-ness called double consciousness. So according to Dubois in 1997, this is the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Okay, so this double consciousness of looking at yourself and having contempt and pity on yourself, and having opposite feelings or emotions for the greater other, supposedly. So we are in a position to view ourselves, albeit tainted with the colors of colonialism imposed upon us that we imbibe through culture, education, etc. This is the same position the theorists like Homi Bhabha and Frantz Fanon have discussed. So they have asked, what are the psychological and cultural legacies of colonialism? So another position that we inhabit is not just of double consciousness, but also the in-betweenness. Okay, in-betweenness in the sense that we want to go back to our traditions, but at the same time we want to modernize and globalize. But modernization and globalization entails so much resources, and how do we develop, or how do we move forward as a nation when we are being tagged as this third world, as this poor, debt, conflict-ridden country, especially now in the pandemic, nadadagdagan yung mga categories na kung nasaan yung mga post-colonial nations katulad ng Pilipinas. Yeah, so these are questions, the postcoloniality as a position that we will be discussing in this course through yun nga, Fanon and Homi Baba. So another way that we can know more about postcolonialism is through postcolonialism as a methodology. So it has been characterized in the literature, no, kahit dun sa dun sa inyong reading kay Young 2003 as these: cultural analysis, political analysis, historical analysis, critical writing, and many more. But when we say methodology, this does not just refer to the method used in studying a certain thing. So this could be methods, analysis, and ways of analysis. But when you say methodology, it encapsulates or it captures the method, the analysis, and the meanings behind why you're doing this analysis, the reasons why you are doing this, for whom this kind of study is. Okay. So what is your process of knowing who or what are you studying? What is behind the things that you want to know? So, and it is the very, post-colonialism is considered as both a theory and as a methodology. Now, because it already has assumptions on how the subjects that it's studying is already known. It has already a framework of power relations that can be applied in analysis. Now, so if we look at these definitions, you will see what I mean. So as postcolonial cultural analysis, it is concerned with the elaboration of theoretical structures that contest the previous dominant Western ways of seeing things. So as you can see there, it assumes that there is a dominant Western way of seeing things, and the cultural analysis would now subvert that and bring to light the opposite, or bring to light the muted ways of seeing things. Okay, so that's how you analyze cultural analysis. Another is historical analysis. Ito, nababanggit na natin kanina. The post-colonial cultural critique involves the reconsideration of the history of oppression and colonialism, particularly from the perspectives of those who suffered its effects, together with the defining of its contemporary social and cultural impact. The history majors would know this, like oral history is also a methodology and a theory. So oral history would now presuppose that there's this dominant method in history where we just look at sources. If it's not written, so the positivist side of history, if it's not written, it's not history. And now oral historians would now say that the experience of people as told by them is also history, as long as you also have the method of triangulation. Ganyan. So in the historical analysis or critique of that is inherent in post-colonial theory, you also have those assumptions, okay, that you want to give a voice to people who are otherwise invisible or voiceless in your methodology or in your study. So that's methodology. It's not just about how you do it, but why you are doing it. Now, another is political analysis. So post-colonial theory involves political analysis of the cultural history of colonialism and investigates its contemporary effects in Western and tricontinental cultures, making connections between that past and the politics of the present. So again, politics, if we discuss this in this context, no, the idea of power who are dominant in terms of defining what culture is, of what a society should look like, right? So post-colonial theory looks at that, no, the idea that you have a history of colonialism that is not just political also, hindi lang siya government, that, you know, another country or another race or another nation came to another nation and governed that nation. It has other implications. Okay, so that's another way of looking at post-colonialism. And post-colonial critique focuses on forces of oppression and coercive domination that operate in the contemporary world. The politics of anti-colonialism and neo-colonialism, race, gender, nationalisms, class, and ethnicities define its terrain. So this definition and preview of the postcolonial critique is actually also a preview of what we will be discussing in this course. So yan, anti-colonial and neo-colonial studies, race, gender, nationalisms, class. So we will be talking about this, and these ideas could easily be discussed in the context of your respective disciplines. Now, finally, in this specific actually to literature, but it is also, in my view, also applicable to writing researches about postcolonialism. So postcolonial discourses include those imaginative or creative and theoretical and or critical writings that seek to establish alternative objects of knowledge in cultural studies, or that experiment with non-mainstream literary modes and rhetorical strategies. So if we use alternative methodologies, like for example, yun nga, yung oral history, it can also be very post-colonial when we use that, because we are kind of opposing a very mainstream idea of history, of that of positivist history. And in our respective uh, disciplines. Okay, when you do a research that is using an alternative method, or is using post-colonial ideas or concepts or methods, such as yun nga, giving a voice to the voiceless or the invisible, it can be liberating, not just to you, but to the people that you study. So it's very critical in that aspect. So that's how Pataho Legasto discusses or defines post-colonial writing. So in general, those enumerated ways of studying postcolonialism can be summarized into the following: criticism and formulation. So this is also what we will do in Soksai 198. So criticize in terms of analyzing the many strategies by which colonized societies have engaged imperial discourse, and studying the ways in which many of those strategies are shared by colonized societies re-emerging in very different political and cultural circumstances. So I remember me saying to my class before that post-colonialism, its main difference with postmodernism would be that it also aims to construct rather than to just deconstruct. So in criticizing, we are deconstructing, but we are also reconstructing a way on how we could use these theories that we have studied in not everyday life, but in our academic life. Okay, so to formulate ways in which we could support emancipation, liberation, etc. So that's the idea of a post-colonialism. So another way that we can characterize post-colonialism is through it as a way of reading. So what kind of reading? Reading essentially in between the lines. The main question is, how do we read texts and make sense of the global range of cultural production? I have mentioned the cultural turn a while ago, as well as globalization. There are many things that are happening in the world right now that you may think is not related to post-colonialism, but could be related to post-colonialism, such as the rise of China as a global power, the global pandemic, biopolitics, the rise of dictators again, the proliferation of Asian cultures and art such as K-pop, anime, etc. So one lens that we can use to read these rapid changes is post-colonialism. Now, so we could read these as post-colonial writing or text, as I have said a while ago, and look at how they were created, why are they created, what are the power, knowledge, relationships that we can relate in their relate in the process of their creation and production. Yan. And so other questions are these phenomena consistent with the claims of post-colonialism that colonialism is still not finished? Or are these responses to this very phenomenon of, or are these responses a response to the very phenomenon of neo-colonialism? Are these ways that post-colonial peoples reclaim their identities and clear a space for themselves? So there are two ways that we can study postcolonialism, like in the past and going to the present, or in the present going to the past. No, so as long as we do not commit the crime of presentism, okay. No, so that's why it's very important that we look at contexts, okay. But we could all see this in the context of culture, in the context of agency, how people define themselves and their identities. In addition to the questions in the previous slide and also in general, I would like to look at postcolonialism as making sense of common sense. So a key aim of much postcolonial writing is to expose the extent to which mainstream scholarship and also frequently our common sense understandings of the social world are firmly grounded in a particularly Western perspective, and thus to draw attention to the epistemological basis of Western power. So I know that we may know or notice this in the cultural products that we consume in our everyday life, in our education system, in our government, that everything is very Western. So in this course we would like to look back in the beginning of is this the way it was before? Are there ways that our disciplines have tried to understand the world in this way? Or are there ways that we can use postcolonialism to nuance those limitations of our disciplines? In this course, thus, we focus on these three ideas that could be said to be the main or common thread of the definitions or our discussions previously. Okay, people, identities, and resistance. First, people. We are concerned with the experiences of people and the way they have spoken about their experience, and in many cases, the way they are spoken for by dominant populations and cultures. We look at positions of marginality where people are stuck after histories of colonizations and real and epistemic violence. We, however, do not generalize, as we always situate people in their respective temporal and spatial context. We will be talking about, in some topics of the course, about the so-called, for example, double colonization of women and the unbroken colonization of indigenous peoples that I have mentioned a while ago. Identity is indeed central to discussions and discourses in postcolonialism. We will meet terms such as hybridity, mimicry, and authenticity, terms referring to the psychological and cultural effects of colonialism. Here, we discuss notions of race as this is discussed by the first theorists of postcolonialism. It is still a salient talking point, especially as racial discrimination is still a lived reality by many people in the world today. Interesting to discuss is how postcolonialism is global and at the same time local. How does globalization proceeding from the colonial legacies affect people's identities or how they present to the world today? As scholars living in a developed country, do you think we have the same voice as scholars in the West? Do we speak enough or write enough? What are the repercussions of the current world order to our self-image? The topic of resistance is also a core component of postcolonialism as a field of study. What are the responses to colonialism? These are not always revolutions. They may not always be visible. There are studies on everyday politics, for example, during the colonial period up to the present, that show how people simultaneously cope and fight against the colonial order. How are decolonizing or decolonized people empowered? Postcolonialism also discusses the role of language in building nations and identities, and how language could also be used to reinforce binaries, and how translation is not an objective task because of the intricacies of language and the culture imbued in it. So after everything, Patajo Legasto tells us the twin process of critique and affirmation um, that are the tasks of postcolonial scholars, which will also be our task in this course. First is to interrogate the European, US, and its other narrativization of history that was utilized and is being employed.
albeit more subtly by retrieving and reevaluating, by producing and reproducing counter-hegemonic alternative cultural text, by retrieving and reevaluating, naulit. But that's number two. Okay, so you interrogate and you retrieve and reevaluate things that could possibly help emancipate, liberate, or define in their own terms the identities of post-colonial peoples. So this could, of course, refer to ourselves as post-colonial, a part of the Filipino people. Okay, so first is to critique and to affirm our own identities. Finally, after we focus on the ideas of people, resistance, and identities, the it's very important to note that post-colonialism has its radical agenda, or has this very ideal dream of emancipation. Okay, emancipating people who write about themselves or who write about their cultures. Okay, so its radical agenda is to demand equality uh, and well-being for all human beings on earth, because sa likod niyan is the idea that equality and well-being cannot be achieved if we do not look at the legacies of colonialism that is present in our daily lives. All the forms of colonialism, usually aims at giving light to issues that are invisible just because we do not dig deeper or we take things as is. It looks for alternatives for people to regain their self-consciousness, their identities, through recognizing that the history of colonialism is a history of injustice that still needs to be addressed and corrected in the present. It looks at culture as a potential weapon for liberation. It aims to destabilize the stable, dominant discourses of linear history, globalization, capitalism, democracy, among others, to unsettle and eventually settle, this time in the words, voice, and terms of the post-colonial. Of course, there are critiques to post-colonialism. We will be discussing this in detail maybe in our synchronous sessions and in our next topics. So, nabanggit ko na to kanina. This is just a summary, kumbaga. Now, one critique is that when you say that post is the end of colonialism or the period after the colonialism, Anne McClintock says that it's haunted by the very figure of linear development that it sets out to dismantle. So we said that we are against linear development, but the very idea of post-colonialism is that we're assuming that it has ended. No, but sabi ko nga kanina, using the term, you use the term knowing all these nuances to it. Okay? So you do not just accept it that this is the end. Post-colonialism means the end of colonialism. Okay? But that's one critique because they are saying, what is there to discuss if colonialism has already ended? Okay? The next is another one that I have mentioned, that it is increasingly or mostly a Western discipline. So it's the critics said that it is a discipline of privileged diasporic third world intellectuals attempting to come to terms with their own conditions within the Western academe. That it's just elitist in a sense because it does not really represent all of the post-colonial peoples. It's also a trend that the thinkers that we will be discussing have been part of European universities. So yung counter naman dito is that they have used their positions in the Western universities to give light or to study their own cultures, no, and to highlight these problems of colonialism. So tingnan natin kung may mga counter pa ba sa mga susunod nating babasahin. And then lastly, a critique to it is it repeats uncritically colonialism's own partitioning strategies. Like for example, when we claim the term third world, when we claim the term South, subaltern, are we not just reinforcing what post-colonial, what colonial, the colonizers have done before? And so, yeah, it's a question of position, okay, geographical and historical differentiation. So that's it for this lecture. The next lectures will be will be for this part of the course, because this is 2 weeks. The rest of the lectures will be on specific topics such as imperialism, colonialism, and the geography. No? So we will discuss more about that geography, about the worlding. Now, why is it important that we know the meanings behind the third world, subaltern, south? No, not just because we want to highlight the identities of these people, but how these terms have been claimed by post-colonial peoples and the scholars through time. Okay, so if you have questions regarding this presentation, this lecture, take note of them, and we will discuss them on our next synchronous session. So thank you very much.